Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchot Beit HaBechira, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. The Rambam begins Hilchot Beit HaBechira by establishing the obligation to build a Beis HaMikdash. Mitzvah aseh lases bayis laHashem. There's a positive commandment to build a house, sanctuary for Hashem. And then the Rambam says, Muchan liyas makrivim b'yakarbanis. It has to be ready. It has to have the ability to facilitate the offering of sacrifices. And the second thing is that you would celebrate to the Beis HaMikdash. That means you would go on a pilgrimage to the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year and bring the special sacrifices there. In other words, the Rambam is telling us, this is the way some understand the Rambam, that the Beis HaMikdash, in order for it to be a Beis HaMikdash, it has to have the ability to facilitate these two things, bringing sacrifices and serving as the place where they would go on pilgrimages 3 times a year. One may say that we're talking about 2 types of obligations. Sacrifices in general could be referring to communal sacrifices, the daily sacrifice, the Karban Tamid, the Karban Musaf, and so on. And the pilgrimage is where the individuals will bring their own personal sacrifice, refers to Karbanis Yachid, individual sacrifices. But the question could be asked, why doesn't the Rambam mention that there's another function of the Beis HaMikdash? That's the seat of the Sanhedrin. And there are many Gemaras that talk about why is it called Har HaMiriah, because from there Torah would go out for all of Israel, because the Sanhedrin was the source of Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah. So it should have said that the Beis HaMikdash was, the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash has to be prepared, has to be able to facilitate the sitting of the Sanhedrin, where the Sanhedrin would reside, and from where they would issue their rulings. Why doesn't it give that as an objective of the Beis HaMikdash? So one could suggest the answer to that is, based on what the Rebbe says in Likutei Sifos, that this requirement that the Beis HaMikdash was a seat of the Sanhedrin, so the Rebbe says this was not a halacha in the Beis HaMikdash. It's not that the Beis HaMikdash needs to have the Sanhedrin there. The Rebbe explains that's not migidrei Beis HaMikdash eladin b'Sanhedrin. It's not that the Beis HaMikdash needs the Sanhedrin, but it's the Sanhedrin that needs to be close to the Shekhinah. As we learn out from the Pasuk, V'leitalem b'malas on Mizbechi, you shouldn't go up on a ramp, on steps to my Mizbeach. You need a ramp. And then right next to that, after talking about the Mizbeach, it says about Elu HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneim. From this we derive that the Sanhedrin, Gedela, the primary Sanhedrin, has to be near the Mizbeach. So what's a din in Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin has to be in the Beis HaMikdash, near the Mizbeach. But it doesn't mean the Beis HaMikdash has to have a Sanhedrin. So it doesn't have to be Muchan. Let's say for some reason the Sanhedrin couldn't reside there. They wouldn't affect and delegitimize the Beis HaMikdash. If they couldn't bring a carbon, then that's not a Beis HaMikdash. If you couldn't go there on the pilgrimage, that couldn't be a Beis HaMikdash. But if you didn't have a Sanhedrin, the Beis HaMikdash is still intact and is not lacking in anything. That answers the question if we say that the Rambam is telling us what are the conditions that make the Beis HaMikdash into a Beis HaMikdash. From other commentaries, it seems that the Rambam is telling us about the matares, the objectives of the Beis HaMikdash. What are the milas, the qualities of the Beis HaMikdash? It's a place where you bring sacrifices, a place where the entire Jewish people would go on a pilgrimage 3 times a year. Well, if that's the case, why not mention also one of the milas of the Beis HaMikdash, that it housed the Sanhedrin? So it could be the Rambam, Hilchos Beit HaMikdash, explains that what did the Sanhedrin do most of the time? Most of the time, they were engaged in inspecting the Kohanim to make sure that they're kosher. They would have to do investigation. They would have to do research into finding out if the Kohen was a kosher Kohen and if the Kohen did not have any blemishes. In other words, and if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that would be the main activity of the Sanhedrin, because if the Sanhedrin was there just for halachas, it's rare that someone would have to bring the case to the Sanhedrin. It's only if the lower courts couldn't find an answer to a question, and they came to the Beis HaMikdash, and there was another Sanhedrin, a smaller Sanhedrin at the entrance of the Beis HaMikdash, and so on. So what was the Sanhedrin doing in the Beis HaMikdash on a regular basis? The Rambam says they were inspecting the Kohanim. Well, that's part of the it's an extension of the matara or of the maila of karbonis, because the Kohanim are needed to do the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, and in order for the Avodah to be done, you need Kohanim. In order for the Kohanim to be acceptable, they have to go through the Sanhedrin. So that's included in the maila of karbonis, that the Beis HaMikdash has to be muchen liyas makrivim by karbonis. That includes everything that was associated with karbonis. When it says karbonis, it doesn't just mean an actual carbon on the mizbeach. Karbonis can mean all the different avodas. The lechem aponim, it means the incense, and that also includes the Sanhedrin, which served in its main function as the inspectors to guarantee that the Kohanim were worthy of doing the avodah. And therefore, it was already included, and the Rambam doesn't have to mention that.